The year was 1945. World War II was drawing to a bloody close in Europe, but for the hundreds of thousands of American soldiers scattered across the continent, the war was not fought with just rifles and tanks. It was fought in the mind. It was a war of morale. Soldiers were exhausted, traumatized, and lonely. They were thousands of miles from home, facing death every day, and their lifeline to sanity was the mail. Letters from home, packages from sweethearts, and news from their families were the only things keeping them human. But the mail system was broken. It was clogged, chaotic, and collapsing under the weight of millions of undelivered letters. It was a crisis that threatened the mental stability of the entire Allied force in Europe. The military leadership had tried everything. They had tried male soldiers. They had tried civilians. No one could clear the backlog. Then, in a moment of desperation and opportunity, they turned to a unit that had been segregated and ignored. They turned to the 6,888th Central Postal Directory Battalion, the 6888. This is the story of the only all-black, all-female battalion to serve overseas in the U.S. Army during World War II. They faced racism, sexism, and the sheer physical exhaustion of moving mountains of mail, and they did the impossible. To understand the magnitude of their achievement, we have to look at the state of the war in early 1945. The Allied forces had pushed the Nazis back, but they were scattered across France, Belgium, and Italy. The logistics were a nightmare. Warehouses in England were overflowing with mail addressed to soldiers who had moved, died, or were in hospitals with no forwarding address. There were millions of letters sitting in dusty piles, some dating back 2 years. Soldiers were begging their commanders for news from home. Morale was plummeting. The Army realized that if they didn't get the mail moving, they risked a breakdown of discipline. The decision was made to deploy a specialized battalion to fix the problem. This was an extraordinary move because it involved women. In 1945, the U.S. military was strictly segregated and strictly male-dominated. But the Women's Army Corps, or WWII, was looking for an opportunity to prove their worth. They handpicked the best, brightest, and toughest African-American women they could find. They were teachers, college graduates, clerks, and factory workers. They were organized, disciplined, and ready to serve. Commanding them was Major Charity Adams, the first black woman to ever be commissioned as an officer in the Army. This was not a soft assignment. This was a heavy-lifting mission in a war zone. When they arrived in Birmingham, England, in February of 1945, the scale of the disaster hit them. They were taken to a massive cold aircraft hangar that had been converted into a sorting facility. Inside, the mail was stacked in mountains. Some letters were rotting from dampness. Packages had burst open, spilling candy and clothes onto the dusty floor. The backlog was so massive that British and American postal workers had given up. They said it would take 6 months to clear. The 6888 was given 3. They worked in 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The conditions were harsh. The hangar was freezing. They had no heating. They had to work in their heavy field jackets and gloves. The dust from the letters filled their lungs. They were dealing with not just mail, but packages meant for soldiers who had been killed in action. Sorting mail intended for the dead took a heavy psychological toll. But they didn't stop. They saw themselves as the voice of home, the voice of mothers and wives reaching out across the ocean to their men. They took the job personally. The work required incredible skill. It wasn't just putting a letter in a box. These women had to become masters of geography. They had to learn the location of every single Army unit, from the smallest platoon to the largest division. They had to track movements daily because units were constantly being relocated to the front lines. If a soldier was moved, they had to redirect his mail. They created a complex card catalog system to track addresses. They had to decode poor handwriting from people back home who didn't know the exact location of their loved ones. They acted as detectives. They would research casualty lists to make sure they didn't sort letters to fallen soldiers, saving grieving families from having their letters returned. They worked with a speed and efficiency that stunned the male officers who observed them. The officers expected them to fail, but they exceeded every expectation. In 1 month, they processed over 4 million pieces of mail. That was mail that had been sitting for over a year. Life for the 6888 was not just about sorting letters. It was about navigating a segregated army. Even as they worked grueling hours to save the morale of the entire U.S. military, they faced discrimination on their own base. They were not allowed to use the officers' club or the other recreational facilities that white soldiers enjoyed. They had to create their own social life. They faced slurs and insults from the very soldiers whose mail they were delivering. But they refused to let this break them. Major Charity Adams was a fierce leader who stood up for her women. There is a famous story where a general came to inspect the facility and told Major Adams that he wanted to keep the facility strictly segregated. He wanted the black women to be separate from the white soldiers who were bringing in the mail. Major Adams looked him in the eye and told him that if he segregated her women, they would not be able to sort the mail efficiently. She told him she would not segregate her unit. She threatened to court-martial him if he tried to interfere with the mission. He backed down. This was the courage of the 688. They didn't just sort mail, they demanded respect. As the war in Europe ended in May of 1945, the mission wasn't over. The 688 was moved to France, to the city of Rouen. They were now dealing with the mail for the occupation forces and the soldiers preparing to go home. The conditions in France were more dangerous. The war was officially over, but the cities were still filled with danger. Unexploded bombs were everywhere. V-2 rockets were still flying. They lived in half-destroyed buildings with no hot water and barely any food. The Red Cross facilities for soldiers were often reserved for white personnel first, so the women of the 6,888th went without. But they kept working. They sorted the victory mail and the letters of congratulations. They ensured that as the men went home to ticker tape parades, they received the love letters waiting for them. They processed over 7 million parcels during their time overseas. They worked at a speed of 65,000 letters per shift. They cleared a backlog that the Army believed was impossible. They turned a chaotic logistical nightmare into a well-oiled machine. Despite their heroism and their massive contribution to the war effort, when the war ended, there were no parades for the 6,888th. When they returned to the United States in early 1946, they came back quietly. They slipped back into a society that still viewed them through the lens of Jim Crow. They went back to their jobs, their families, and their lives. They didn't receive medals immediately. They didn't receive the GI Bill benefits that white soldiers got. They didn't even receive a thank you from the Pentagon for decades. The Army disbanded their unit, and the history books seem to conveniently forget that the mail system had been saved by a battalion of black women. For decades, their story was a footnote, a whisper in the archives of history. The women didn't talk about it much either. They had done their duty, and that was enough for them. They were proud of their service, proud that they had been the first, and proud that they had never given up. But they deserved more. They deserved to be recognized as the heroines they were. It would take decades for the world to catch up to what the 6,888th had accomplished. It wasn't until the 21st century that their story truly began to emerge from the shadows. In 2018, the Buffalo Soldier Association of Detroit fought to have them recognized. In 2019, the U.S. Congress passed a bill to award the 6,888 the Congressional Gold Medal. It is the highest civilian honor in the nation. Finally, in March of 2022, a ceremony was held at the U.S. Capitol. President Joe Biden signed the bill into law. By that time, only a few of the women were still alive to receive it. The oldest member of the unit, Private First Class Fanny Griffin McClendon, was over 100 years old when she finally saw her country acknowledge her service. The medals were awarded posthumously to the others. It was a bittersweet victory, a celebration that came far too late, but it was a victory nonetheless. The story of the 6,888 is now being taught in schools. It is being told in documentaries and movies. People are finally learning that the GIs who defeated Hitler didn't do it alone. They had an army of women behind them, women of color, working in the dark to keep them connected to home. The legacy of the 6,888th Central Postal Directory Battalion is a lesson in resilience and dignity. They prove that gender and skin color have nothing to do with competence, strength, or patriotism. They stepped up when their country called, even when that country treated them as second-class citizens. They faced a mountain of mail, and they moved it. They faced a mountain of prejudice, and they climbed over it. They are the ancestors of every black woman who serves in the military today. They are the inspiration for every person who is told they cannot do a job because of who they are. The 6,888 shows us that no task is too small if it serves a greater good. Mail might just be paper and ink, but to a soldier in a foxhole it is hope. It is the promise of a future. These women delivered that hope. They were the backbone of the Allied force. They were the 6,888, and today we finally salute them.